Hello, class. So today I'm going to review human genetic diseases, and I'm also going to go over some some pedigree charts. Excuse me, some pedigree charts. Okay. All right. Mendel's laws. Genetic disorders are medical conditions caused by alleles that are inherited from parents. Okay. Autosomes is a term you should know. Autosomes are any chromosome other than the sex chromosome, meaning X or Y. So that will be chromosomes numbers 1 through 22. Those are known as our autosome chromosomes. Genetic disorders caused by genes on autosomes are called autosomal disorders. Autosomal disorders. So some genetic disorders are autosomal dominant, meaning an individual with big A has the disorder. So if you have an autosomal dominant disorder, if you have inherited two capital alleles, then you would express the disorder. An individual with heterozygous big A little a would also have the disorder. Why? Because you only need one capital letter to express a dominant trait. An individual with both lowercase a's or little a does not have the disorder and they would be considered normal. Okay. Other genetic disorders are autosomal recessive. So an individual with two capital A's does not have the disorder. In this instance, they would be normal. An individual heterozygous big A little a, they still do not have the disorder, but they carry the trait. They carry the trait. And an individual with little a, they do have the disorder. So, in an autosomal recessive disorder, in order for you to express the trait, you need two lowercase letters, two lowercase letters. All right, a pedigree analysis. So, pedigrees reveal Mendelian patterns in human inheritance. Data is usually mapped on a family tree, as we see here. So we're going to go ahead and look at two different types of pedigrees. This one here is going to be considered our dominant trait, and this one here is going to be our recessive. Okay, I just put RE for recessive. Okay, so to read pedigree charts, it's always best to add genotypes, meaning add the letterings to the bottom of the shapes so that you can have a visualization of what can possibly be the outcomes. Okay, so squares are going to indicate males, circles are females. Anything that is shaded means that they have the trait, Okay, so let's look at widow's peak. Widow's peak is a dominant disorder, or not, excuse me, disorder. It's a dominant trait. It's a dominant allele that is being passed on. So I have two individuals, a male and a female. The line across means that they are married or they are together. Line going down meaning this is going to be their offspring. So they have a female with widow's peak. They have a son without widow's peak. They have another son with no widow's peak. And then they also have another son with widow's peak. Okay. Then we have these other two individuals where we have the father that does not have widow's peak, but the mother does not. So they're married. They have two daughters. One of their daughters has widow's peak, one does not. These two individuals then marry and have two daughters themselves, one with widow's peak and then one without. Okay. So as we could see with the dominant disorder, with the dominant trait, all you need is one capital letter to express the trait. Okay. Now, when we look at recessive traits, in order for you to have or exhibit a recessive trait, you have to have two lowercase alleles, as we see here. So if I look at these two parents, so same thing, I have these parents, they don't have, they don't have attached earlobes. Okay. They have free earlobes. They have 4 children. Same thing, they have a daughter and 3 sons. Their daughter is normal. And then they have 2 sons that have attached earlobes. Whereas we see these individuals here, the dad has attached earlobes, mom does not. They have 2 daughters. One of their daughters here has attached earlobes. These 2 individuals marry, and they themselves have 2 daughters. One has attached earlobes, and one does not. Okay. Okay, let's go on. So here's a sample pedigree analysis. So to do this pedigree, what is the likely inheritance pattern? What is the likely inheritance pattern? Would this be an autosomal dominant or an autosomal recessive disorder? So I want you to think about that. This here would be an autosomal recessive disorder. I'm sorry. Sorry. A dominant. This would be an autosomal dominant. Geez, Miss Gonzalez, it's a late night today, guys. Give me a break. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give these individuals letters. When I give them letters, then it makes it easier for me to visually see what's going on. Okay. They both have it. So if this is a dominant trait, then I definitely know that these 2 children express it and these 2 do not. They would be little a. So this here would be normal. And these 2 individuals would exhibit the trait. Now, the reason why it cannot be autosomal recessive, well, if I gave them both little a, right? And if you do the Punnett square on that, then all of their children would be shaded, okay? Because they don't, then we have to go back and think, okay, well, what's the alternative? And in that instance, it would be the dominant trait, okay? It would be the dominant trait. All right, here's some more other practice pedigrees. All right, for X-linked, how do I know it would be an X-linked? In these instances, the females would be carriers. So a female can only be a carrier if it is X-linked recessive, okay? If I look at this one, take an analysis on this one. This here would be autosomal recessive. And how I would know that? Well, if I give the parents, once again, big A, little a, we're in the capital letter is normal and the little letter or the little allele is recessive. So same thing. So this individual, in order for them to have it, they would have to have both lowercase letters. And so as we see these individuals marry, they have a daughter, a son, and another daughter. She doesn't have it, so she at least has a capital letter. She doesn't have it either. She would have that. So as we said, if it is an autosomal recessive, then that means that everybody that has 2 lowercase letters would be shaded, like this individual here. All right, genetic counseling. Pedigrees can help us understand the past and predict the future. Thousands of genetic disorders are inherited as simple recessive traits, from benign conditions to deadly diseases. We have traits such as albinism, cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs, sickle cell anemia, and PKU. So we're going to look at a little bit of these in depth. All right, recessive diseases. These diseases are recessive because the allele codes for either a malfunctioning protein or no protein at all. Heterozygous individuals who are capital and lowercase letters are considered carriers of the disorder. They have the normal phenotype because of one normal allele, but they produce enough of the required proteins. So they're normal, but they carry the malfunctioning trait. Okay, so they can pass on this trait or this allele. All right, one of the disorders we want to look at is cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is autosomal recessive. Okay, Cystic fibrosis occurs primarily in whites of European descent. It strikes about 1 in every 2,500 births, and about 1 in 25 whites is a carrier of cystic fibrosis. So they're heterozygotes. The normal allele codes for a membrane protein that transports chlorine across the cell membrane. Defective or absent channels limit the transport of chlorine and water across the cell membrane. So that means that individuals born with cystic fibrosis have a defective or an absent channel. They have stickier and thicker mucus coats that surrounds their cells. So they don't have the enzyme that basically helps to break up the mucus in the systems. Because this channel is not functioning, the mucus then starts to become thick and it coats the cells. It builds up in the pancreas, lungs, digestive tract, and it can cause bacterial infections. Without the treatment, children would die before the age of 5. So, like in the 70s and like early 80s, this was a childhood disorder in which these individuals would die. Now, with treatment and gene therapy, individuals can live past their late 20s, past their late 20s. Well, why do they actually die? So, eventually, what happens over time is, as we can see here, the mucus tends to stay blocked and it stays within the lungs or this alveoli sac. Eventually, the lungs fill up with way too much mucus and then they end up suffocating. So they pretty much have like a cold like every single day of their life. As we can see here, the mom is patting down the chest so that to help loosen up the mucus. This is all due to a deletion of an amino acid. Okay, so it's found on chromosome number 7, the CFTR gene, and phenolphthalein, as we see here, is deleted. So this here is a mutation in the gene. Right, another disorder you should know about is Tay-Sachs. Tay-Sachs is an also autosomal recessive disorder, and it's found in the primary Jews of Eastern Europe, or the Ashkenazi Jews, and in the Cajuns found in Louisiana. It strikes about 1 in every 3,600 births. It's 100 times greater than incidence amongst non-Jews. Okay, so what happens is individual born with Tay-Sachs have a non-functioning enzyme that does not break down lipids in the brain or the fats. So what happens is the fats collect in the cells, which then destroy the brain function. Symptoms begin a few months after birth. These children have seizures, they become blind, their muscles degenerate, and then they mentally just start going downhill. This is a fatal disorder, so children born with this disorder do die before the age of 5. They die before the age of 5. All right, this is one that you really have to know. So please make sure that you guys know everything about sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a recessive disorder. It's found primarily in Africans and it strikes about 1 out of 400 African Americans. It's a high frequency. So it's caused by a substitution of a single amino acid found in the hemoglobin. So one letter change causes the cells to sickle in shape. Okay, hemoglobin is an enzyme that helps to carry oxygen found in our red blood cells. When oxygen levels are low, sickle cell hemoglobin crystallizes into these long rods as we see here. Normally, your red blood cells look like these circular discs, and they're shaped like that so that they can fit and flow through the blood vessels. Now, if your cells start to sickle, these cells here don't flow freely in your blood vessels and they can back up. Well, if the blood flow starts to back up, then certain areas in your body don't get oxygen. Tissue then can become damaged. If the tissue is damaged, then that can also affect the organ and people can die. So it deforms the red blood cells into sickle shape and it creates a cascade of other symptoms. So as we see here, this is what your normal blood cells will look like. Because one letter changes in the DNA sequence, we now change glutamine to valine, which now causes these cells to sickle. So this just is a visualization to show you what happens with people that have sickle cell anemia and how it can affect the body. Whole lot of damage that can be done. All right, now sickle cell anemia has two alleles which are codominant. So remember, anything that is codominant means that both alleles show. So both normal and mutant hemoglobins are synthesized in heterozygous individual. So if you are heterozygous, meaning that you have a normal allele and a sickle cell allele, half of your cells sickle and half of them are normal. Now, the carrier is usually healthy, so they don't really exhibit any really threat of sickle cell anemia. However, it can be triggered under blood oxygen stress due to exercise. So you would have to limit your exercise so that your cells don't sickle. All right. All right. This disorder has to do with malaria. So there's an advantage which is known as the heterozygous advantage. Okay, and it has to do with this little malarial parasite. So mosquitoes, if we look here, mosquitoes suck up from the bloodstream. Malaria parasites mate and move from the mosquito's gut to the salivary glands. When the bugs bite man, their saliva passes the parasites on. So these parasites here are found in like infested waters. And so the mosquitoes then can take this parasite, and then when they bite the human, okay, these parasites here then start to fester inside of the liver, and then they migrate into your red blood cells. Once these parasites are in your blood cells, notice here that they lay their eggs, and then it causes malaria or malaria fever. This can lead to death. Okay? So, what is meant by the heterozygous advantage? Like I said, malaria is a single celled eukaryotic parasite that spends part of its life cycle in the red blood cells. Now, in tropical area where malaria is common, we also see a high rate of sickle cell anemia. Well, why is that? Okay. So if you are homozygous dominant, meaning that you have two normal alleles, you'll end up dying from malaria. Okay. If you are homozygous recessive, meaning that you have two lowercase alleles, you end up dying from sickle cell anemia. Okay, why is that? Because in tropical Africa, the medical system or the healthcare system is not great. Now, it's a third world country. So, because medical system's not great, you will not get treatment. So, if you get malaria and you're normal, you die. If you have sickle cell, you don't have good treatment, you die. However, if you are a heterozygous, meaning that you have inherited a capital and a lowercase letter, you're free from both malaria and sickle cell anemia. That then gives you a reproductive advantage and allows you to reproduce. Okay, so there's a high frequency of the sickle cell allele in African Americans, as we see. So here's kind of just a map to show you the prevalence of malaria. So as we see in these maps, when there is a high rate of malaria, there's a high rate of sickle cell, as we see. And that sickle cell allele, for those individuals that are heterozygous, gives them an advantageous event at life. So they're able to pass on their genes because they survive. Right, the last disorder we're going to look at is Huntington's. Huntington's is a dominant disorder. So the other three that we looked at were recessive disorders. This here is a dominant disorder. Now, in order for you to inherit a dominant disorder, all you need is one allele. Remember, in recessive disorders, you need two alleles. In dominant disorders, you only need one allele to express it. So you have a higher rate of passing this allele on. Basically, you have a 50% chance of passing it on. So, in Huntington's, it's a dominant inheritance. And what happens is there's a repeated mutation on the end of chromosome number 4. That then causes a buildup of the Huntington protein in the brain, which causes cell death. So, it basically eats away at your brain. Okay, not eats away at your brain, but it builds up, which then causes the cells to die in your brain. Causes then memory loss, causes your muscles to tremor. This disorder usually starts at around the age between 30 and 50. Now that's bad. Why is that? Because it's a fatal disorder. You end up dying from this. So it's an early death You usually do live with the disorder from like 10 to 20 years once you start showing symptoms of it. However, usually people between the ages of 30 and 50 have reproduced already. So if you've already reproduced, that means that you have a 50% chance of passing this disorder from yourself to your offspring. Why? Because of the dominant disorder. So if you show symptoms, let's say at age 40, and you didn't know around in your family, then you could pass on that trait to your children. You have a 50% chance trait of passing that on. All right. Now, environmental effects, phenotype or traits are controlled by both the environment and your genes. So, human skin color is influenced by both genetics and environmental conditions, as we stated. So, people that live around the equator tend to have darker skin. Why? Because the more melanin, which gives a skin coloration, we have, melanin also helps to protect us from the sun. So, if you have a lot of melanin, you have dark skin. If you live around the equator where the environment is warm and you're subjected to the sun a lot, darker skin equals a reproductive advantage. Why? Because if you have a lot of melanin, protects you from the sun, which would then protect you from skin cancer. Okay. All right, same thing. The color of hydrangeas, as we see here, is influenced by the pH found inside of the soil. And then coat color, as we see here, is influenced um, by weather. All right, guys, that's it. I hope you learned something new. You should have learned a little bit about pedigrees as well as the difference between autosomal recessive and autosomal dominant disorders.